The story starts in Riverton, a town glowing with colorful lights and decorations. The streets are covered in a thin layer of snow, and laughter and music fill the air from small restaurants in the town square. Everything seems joyful, like a typical New Year's Eve celebration. But something feels strange, like a shadow hiding behind the festive lights. It's as if something isn't right, though no one can explain why. At the edge of the town, far from the happy crowds, Detective Ethan Shaw stands in front of an old, run-down warehouse. The cold winter air bites his face, but that's not what makes him shiver. Inside the warehouse, the body of a young man lies on the cold, hard floor. Ethan's flashlight shines on the man's face, showing an expression frozen in fear, as if he had seen something too terrible to imagine. The man's body looks strange. His skin is pale, almost gray, and his flesh seems dry, like all the life was drained out of him. Ethan examines the scene carefully, trying to figure out what happened. There are no signs of a struggle, no open wounds, and no blood. Everything is eerily quiet, too perfect and too still. The investigation didn't give many answers. The victim was Peter Lang, a quiet college student who didn't seem to have any enemies. He was found in the warehouse for no clear reason. Witnesses said the last time they saw Peter was just a few hours ago when he left a small grocery store. No one knew why he went to the warehouse or how he ended up in such a strange situation. But there was a small clue that Ethan couldn't stop thinking about. Near Peter's body, a black card was found. It was small and simple, with the number 1 carved on it. On the other side of the card, there was a short message saying 1 of 12. The number on the card didn't make sense to Ethan. The message seemed strange and out of place, as if it was meant for someone specific. It felt like part of a bigger plan, something mysterious and unsettling. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random crime, but part of something much darker, something hidden deep within the quiet town of Riverton. That night, Ethan returned to the police station with his mind full of unanswered questions. The initial reports didn't help much. There were no signs of poison in Peter's body, no clear injuries, except for something strange about his heart. It looked like it had frozen inside his chest, even though the rest of his body was at a normal temperature. Everything about Peter Lang's death felt impossible to explain with normal logic. Ethan tried to write down what he had discovered so far, but his thoughts kept going back to the black card. The words 1 of 12 felt like they were trying to tell him something. Was it a warning? Or maybe some kind of threat? The mystery bothered him more than anything else. Outside, the soft sound of the church bells rang, signaling that the new year was getting closer. The town seemed peaceful, but underneath that calm surface, something dark had started. As Ethan sat deep in thought, memories of old stories and strange cases began to fill his mind. He had heard about similar deaths before that, victims with no clear cause of death, chosen seemingly at random, surrounded by eerie rumors. Then, a name from those stories whispered in his mind, and it's the counter. Ethan didn't believe in superstitions, but the story suddenly seemed connected to what was happening now. According to the legend, the counter was a supernatural being that appeared every new year to punish those who broke their promises or oaths. It was just a tale to scare children, Ethan thought, but the dried-up body and the black card seemed to tell a different story. While Ethan reviewed the evidence again, somewhere else in the city, another person opened an envelope they had just received. Inside was another black card, this time with the number 2 carved on it. The person stared at the card, their breath quickening. But before they could react, they heard footsteps behind them. Moments later, the night fell silent once again. The next day, the night in Riverton grew colder, but the town square stayed lively, full of New Year's cheer. Twinkling lights on tall trees lit up the streets, but they couldn't chase away the shadows creeping in the dark corners of the town. At the police station, Ethan Shaw sat at his desk, staring at the small black card he had found at the crime scene. The number 1 was carved into it, like a message that felt both threatening and mysterious. Across the desk, the first forensic report had arrived, but it didn't provide many answers. The cause of the victim's death was still unknown. Something strange had happened to the victim's heart that it looked frozen, but there were no signs of poison or chemicals in the body. Ethan read the report again, hoping to spot something he missed, but all he found was more confusion. Meanwhile, in another part of town, someone else discovered a second black card. This time, the number 2 was carved into it. The person was an old woman living alone in a wooden house by the forest. She opened the card with trembling hands and read the short message on the back, saying 2 of 12. The air around her grew icy cold, colder than the winter night itself. Before she could make sense of it, a shadow passed by her window. Moments later, the night went silent, and everything ended. Ethan learned about the second victim a few hours later. This time, the victim was found at home. Just like the first, there were no signs of a struggle. The old woman was discovered sitting in her rocking chair, her face frozen in fear. Her skin was pale, her body stiff, and once again, there was no blood. The only clue left behind was the second black card, sitting on a small table beside her. Shortly after, Ethan arrived at the crime scene, his footsteps heavy as his mind raced with questions. He carefully looked at the victim's body and the room around him. There were no signs of a break-in, no proof that anyone else had been inside the house. Everything seemed too perfect, like it was part of a pattern, a game planned by someone very clever. As the night grew darker, the mood in Riverton began to shift. People started whispering about the counter, an old legend that had always been told to scare children. The story spoke of a mysterious figure that appeared every new year to punish those who broke their promises, taking the souls of those who deserved it. Ethan heard these rumors, but he didn't believe them. To him, this was the work of a smart killer, someone who knew how to use fear to cover their tracks. Still, the facts didn't make sense. 2 black cards, 2 victims, and a message that felt like a countdown to something bigger. Ethan realized he didn't have much time. If the pattern continued, more people would die before the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve. He had to figure out the connection about who would be the next victim and why they were being targeted. Back at the police station, Ethan dug through old files, hoping to find a clue. As he read about past cases, a pattern started to form in his mind. He found records of strange deaths that happened 25 years ago in Riverton. Those victims were also found in unusual conditions, but the technology back then couldn't explain much. One detail stood out, that the deaths happened on New Year's Eve, with the same amount of time between each victim. Ethan felt the weight of the case growing heavier on his shoulders. Riverton was a small town with only a few resources, which made solving the case even harder. A troubling thought lingered in his mind, refusing to go away. It seemed possible that this wasn't just the work of a human killer. The legend people were whispering about started to feel strangely real. The night wind howled outside the police station window, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Time was ticking, and Ethan knew the countdown had already begun. Now, the clock on the police station wall showed 3 a.m. The lively town square of Riverton was now quiet, with only silence left behind. Ethan Shaw sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen filled with old reports and archived newspaper articles. A pattern was starting to form, though it was still blurry and full of gaps. In the archives, Ethan found records of a tragedy that happened 25 years ago on the same night when Riverton was celebrating New Year's Eve. The deaths back then were eerily similar to what he was investigating now. Some victims were found in nearly the same condition with dried-up bodies, faces frozen in fear, and no trace of how it happened. The forensic reports from that time didn't reveal much, but one detail sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Every victim, without exception, was found with a black card nearby. The numbers carved on the cards formed a countdown, like a cruel game created by the killer or perhaps something not human. Ethan read the old notes carefully. At the end of the archive, one name caught his attention, and it's Robert Crane, a local journalist who had written about the case. Crane's articles showed his deep obsession with Riverton's local legend. He insisted that the murders weren't done by a person, but by an entity called the Counter. In one of his writings, Crane described the legend in detail that the Counter was a shadowy figure that appeared every New Year's Eve, punishing those who broke promises, oaths, or moral duties. It was a dark force, coming to collect debts that could never be repaid. At that moment, Ethan almost laughed when he read it. To him, it seemed like the journalist was just trying to grab attention. But the name Robert Crane stayed in his mind, bothering him. He decided to dig deeper and found something shocking. Not long after Crane wrote his final article, he was found dead. His body was discovered in his own apartment, in the same strange condition as the other victims. Even though Ethan didn't believe in anything supernatural, the facts were too strange to ignore. There was a strange link between what was happening now and the events from 25 years ago. If the legend was true, the victims must have been connected somehow. Maybe they had all broken a promise, or perhaps something much darker was binding them together. As the morning light crept in, Ethan decided he needed more answers. He visited Riverton's town library, where old articles and records were kept. There, he uncovered more about the town's history. Riverton had a dark past. New Year celebrations had always been special for the people, but something scary was hidden beneath the joy. Over a century ago, a terrible tragedy took place. 12 people were killed at a New Year's Eve party in an old church, which later crumbled to ruins. That tragedy became the start of the legend of the Counter. According to the story, the Counter was the vengeful spirit of one of the victims, betrayed by a close friend. Since then, it was said that the spirit returned every New Year's Eve to punish those it believed didn't deserve to start a new year. Then, Ethan closed the last file with a heavy sigh. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural, but the pattern he was seeing couldn't be ignored. Each new piece of information made the case feel heavier, and every question he answered seemed to lead to even more unsettling mysteries. Outside the library, the snow was falling harder, covering the town in a cold, silent blanket. Ethan walked back to the police station, a growing sense of unease following him with every step. It felt like he was getting closer to something he wasn't ready to face. When he entered his office, a new report was already waiting on his desk. There was a third victim. This time, it was a middle-aged man who worked as a night guard at one of Riverton's small factories. Just like the others, his body was dry, and the same frozen look of fear was on his face. Next to him was the third black card. The number 3 was carved into it, along with a message that felt more like a warning, now saying 3 of 12. Time is running out. At that time, Ethan began to realize that this was far bigger than anything he had imagined. This wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about stopping something that seemed unstoppable. Time was ticking, and the countdown wasn't over yet. The following day, night in Riverton grew darker, not just because of the winter sky covered in clouds, but because of the fear spreading through the town. 3 deaths had shaken everyone. Each victim was left the same way with a dry body, a face frozen in fear, and a black card with a number that kept going up. Rumors about the counter were spreading fast. People who once thought the legend was just a myth were now wondering if there was truth to the old story. Ethan Shaw didn't have the luxury of believing in superstitions. He was a detective, and his job was to find facts, even when those facts became harder to understand. After the third victim was found, Ethan noticed another pattern. The victims didn't know each other, but they all had something in common that promises they had broken in the past. And Peter Lang, the first victim, had promised to help his mother pay off her debts but had ignored her instead. The second victim, the old woman, had once sworn in church to keep her husband's dark secret, but later revealed it. The third victim, the night guard, had promised his children to be there for them, but broke his word for quick money. Ethan tried to dismiss these connections as coincidence, but the evidence was becoming too strong to ignore. The black cards weren't just counting the victims, cause they were delivering a message, almost like a moral judgment. Whoever was behind this seemed to know secrets no one else should have known. That morning, Ethan decided to take an unusual step. He went back to the town library, where he had previously found old records about the strange deaths from 25 years ago. This time, he wanted to dig deeper. With the help of an old, quiet librarian, Ethan found files about the old church tied to the legend of the counter. The church, called Holy Trinity Church, had once been the heart of Riverton's spiritual life until New Year's Eve in 1899. On that night, a big party turned into a disaster when a mysterious fire destroyed the entire building, killing 12 people. No one ever discovered the cause. According to the legend, one of the victims, a man named Thomas Vale, had suffered the most. He had been betrayed by his friends and left to die. Before he passed, he swore he would return to seek revenge. As Ethan read this, he began to sense a connection between the past and what was happening now. The story of Thomas Vale seemed linked to the strange events in Riverton. Even though Thomas was just a figure from an old legend, the idea of the legend coming to life felt unsettling. Ethan tried to shake off these thoughts, reminding himself that the answers had to come from facts, not old ghost tales. In the middle of his search, Ethan's phone rang with an emergency call. A fourth victim had been found. This time, it was a 16-year-old high school boy discovered in the school's music room. Like the others, his body was dry and lifeless, with a black card nearby. The number 4 was carved into it, and the message on the back was longer than before, saying 4 of 12. The new year is not for those who fail to change. Ethan arrived at the scene, feeling even more frustrated. This victim was just a teenager, too young and innocent to be caught up in something like this. But as he investigated further, Ethan learned that the boy had once promised his teacher he would confess to cheating on a final exam, but never did. Even a mistake that small seemed enough to make him a target. As New Year's midnight drew closer, Ethan felt like he was racing against something he couldn't see. A small part of him wondered if he should believe in the legend, even though his heart didn't want to. One thing was clear, that if the pattern continued, there would be 8 more victims before the night was over. When Ethan returned to the police station, his mind was busy thinking of ways to stop the cycle. He decided to look deeper into the lives of the victims, hoping to find a bigger pattern that could lead him to the next target. He also asked for extra patrols around the town, especially near places with dark histories. But no matter what he tried, it felt like he was chasing shadows. Whoever or whatever the counter was, it always seemed to stay one step ahead. Sitting at his desk, Ethan stared at the black cards collected as evidence. 4 cards for victims and 8 numbers still waiting to be filled. Time wasn't on his side, and every second that passed brought the next death closer. Outside the window, snow kept falling, covering Riverton in a soft white blanket that looked peaceful. But Ethan knew better. The town was being haunted not just by an old legend, but by something that felt more real than ever. The clock ticked slowly, and the countdown continued. As night fell, the bright sky over Riverton turned dark and gloomy. Thick clouds hung low, making the air feel heavy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing through the old buildings. The wind blew hard, spinning dry leaves in circles like a ghostly dance. The happy celebration in the town square started to feel tense. People tried to keep having fun, but an uneasy feeling spread, as if something bad was coming. Ethan Shaw stood at the edge of the square, watching the crowd carefully. Heavy rain began to pour, cold and strong, like the sky was crying in sadness. Lightning lit up the town for a moment, creating strange shadows on the buildings. In Ethan's hand was the fourth black card, taken from the last victim. The number carved into it felt more like a warning than just a clue. In the middle of the square, the clock tower's chimes began to ring. The big clock, a symbol of Riverton's traditions, was counting down to midnight, ready to welcome the new year. But tonight, the chimes sounded different, like a countdown to something bad. The cheerful noises of the celebration mixed with the howling wind. Children's laughter sounded uneasy, as if everyone could feel something was wrong. Ethan felt nervous. He knew this night wouldn't end peacefully, for victims had already been found, but the number 12 wasn't complete. He was sure that whoever or whatever was behind this had a plan, and it would reach its peak when the clock struck midnight. Time was running out. At 11 o'clock, the storm became wild. Rain poured harder like cold water, splashing everywhere. Lightning flashed again and again, lighting up the sky like bright, broken lights. Thunder boomed loudly, like a giant beast roaring. People started running to find shelter, hurrying into buildings near the town square. But some stayed outside, standing under umbrellas or tents, trying to act like everything was fine. But some people felt something strange. It was like invisible eyes were watching them. The wind felt cold on their necks, and the sound of whispers mixed with the rain. There, Ethan stayed in the square, watching the crowd. He looked closely at every face and every movement, trying to spot anything unusual. But everything looked normal, even though the air felt heavier with every passing minute. As the clock got closer to midnight, something strange happened. The square's lights flickered and went out, leaving everything in darkness. Only the flashes of lightning lit up the area, making shadows dance in scary shapes. People started shouting, some trying to stay calm, but panic began to grow. Ethan grabbed his radio to call his team, but all he heard was loud static. Then something appeared. On the clock tower, a dark figure stood tall. Lightning lit up the sky, showing its shape. It looked like a shadow, but it felt real, making Ethan's skin crawl. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently watching the town. Soon after, the first bell rang, and Ethan felt his whole body freeze. Around the town square, people began to collapse one by one. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, just an eerie silence as their bodies fell lifeless to the ground. Each time the bell chimed, more people dropped, until rainwater on the streets mixed with dark red streams. Ethan ran toward the clock tower. He knew the figure standing there was the key to everything happening. Gripping his weapon tightly, he pushed open the tower door and climbed the spiral staircase. The stairs were dark and slippery, and each step felt harder, as if something was trying to pull him back. Above him, the bell kept ringing, counting down the moments. When Ethan reached the top, the figure was still there. He raised his weapon, ready to stop it. But before he could pull the trigger, the figure turned around. It had no face, No clear shape and just a shadowy emptiness. Yet within that darkness, Ethan saw something that made him freeze. He saw himself, reflections of his broken promises, mistakes he had ignored, and lives he had hurt stared back at him. Moments later, the final bell rang, and the figure disappeared. Ethan fell to the floor, soaked in cold sweat and shaking. When he finally got up and went back to the square, the town was different. There were no sounds, no living people. Only puddles of rain and blood remained as the storm began to fade. When morning came, Riverton was quiet and empty. Ethan stood all alone in the town square, staring at the last black card lying on the ground. The number 12 was carved into it. This time, there was no message, only silence all around him. Ethan didn't know if everything was over or if something worse was about to start. But he knew one thing, that Riverton would never be the same after what had happened. The morning felt sad and gloomy. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and wet, like a blanket of sadness covering the town. The sun hid behind dark clouds, leaving everything gray and dull. The streets that were full of New Year's cheer the night before were now cold and quiet. Puddles of rain mixed with blood trickled down the streets, and the holiday lights hung limp, barely flickering. Ethan stood in the square, feeling tired and confused. His eyes stayed fixed on the scene around him. In his hand, the final black card with the number 12 felt cold and heavy, like it carried a big, dark secret. 12 people had died in just one night, and Ethan had no clear answers to explain why. He remembered the final moments of the night with the shadowy figure on the clock tower, the ringing bells, and the strange reflection of himself in the darkness. The memory sent chills through him, but he refused to let fear hold him back. Whatever had happened that night, Ethan knew he had to find the truth. Riverton needed answers, even if it meant stepping into the darkness once again. As the sun tried to peek through the clouds, the forensic team arrived, along with Ethan's fellow officers. Everyone looked confused and scared, unsure where to begin. 12 victims had been found, each with a black card near their body, and none showed signs of a struggle. The bodies were taken away, but traces of what happened remained with bloodstains, personal items left behind, and a heavy feeling of fear in the air. But something felt wrong. As Ethan identified the victims, he noticed one of the black cards didn't belong to any of them. The last card, the one he found in the square, should have been for the final victim. However, there was no 12th body. There were 12 cards, but only 11 victims. The thought unsettled him. If the last card wasn't used, it meant the cycle might not be over. Someone or something was still out there, waiting to complete the count. As the day wore on, Ethan decided to return to the clock tower. He felt like something had been left behind, something that might explain what had happened. The spiral stairs he had climbed the night before were still wet from the rain, and the air inside the tower felt colder than outside. When he reached the top, the room was empty, but something was different. The tower walls, which had been bare before, were now covered in writing. The writing on the walls looked like it had been carved with something sharp. Words were scattered everywhere, forming a messy pattern. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over, saying, "Broken promises never die." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The words seemed to speak directly to him, bringing back memories he had tried to bury for years. Promises he had made to his family, his friends, and even to himself, for promises he had broken through choices he now regretted. He wondered maybe that's why he felt so connected to everything happening. As he stepped back, something caught his eye. In the center of the floor, right beneath the tower's big bell, was an object he hadn't noticed before, and it's a black card. Ethan crouched down to pick it up. The moment his fingers touched the card, a chilling wave ran through his entire body. The card was blank, no number, no message. But Ethan knew it wasn't for another victim. It was his card. Holding the card tightly, Ethan ran out of the tower, his mind racing to make sense of it all. When he reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the square, he froze. Standing in the middle of the square was a dark figure, completely still, staring straight at him. It wasn't human. It was a shadow of something beyond understanding. Before Ethan could react, the sound of the bell rang out one more time, and it's a single chime that shattered the morning silence. The dark figure disappeared, but its final words lingered in the air, like a whisper saying, "You know who's next." Ethan looked down at the black card in his hand. There was no number on it, but he understood the count wasn't over. And this time, he wasn't just a detective. He was now part of the game,